We're going to look at the Bible now, because this is a part of how we become people who are courageous in mission, Bible-saturated, Spirit-dependent, and loving of others. And today we're looking at prayer. For those of you who are watching on a video, the reason why there's giggling in the background slightly is because the camera wasn't on, so I've just done that intro twice. Learning to pray is the single most important thing we can do in the spiritual life. It's the single most important thing you can learn as a Christian, by a country mile. Second most important thing is to meditate on the scriptures, which is why you should listen to last week's talk. But prayer is the most important. It's actually the center of everything else. Everything else orbits around it. When you meditate on the scriptures or you meditate in other ways, what you're really doing is praying. You're praying through the Bible and praying through silence and those kinds of things. Prayer is important. Prayer is important for at least two reasons. First is how we grow in the knowledge of and use by God. It's how you grow to know God more and be used by Him more. If you want to be a demon-driving, sickness-healing, good news proclaiming, consequential man or woman of God, then the single skill you need to learn is to pray. And I would go further than that. If you don't learn to pray, if we don't learn to pray, then you will struggle to achieve anything of consequence in the spiritual life, and anything of lasting consequence in the rest of life. If that sounds black and white, it is intended to. Okay, I really, really mean it. You can dig into any tradition of the church, Pentecostal, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, whatever you want, Baptist, you will dig in and find that the man or woman you are looking at deep down was a man or woman of prayer. Without exception. Every single one of them who has achieved anything and who has a legacy built it on prayer. It becomes obvious that that's the case when you read the Bible. I'll give you 3 illustrations, but it's obvious because of the priority, the weight that people put on prayer. Jesus thought prayer was more important than sleep. Now, I don't know what you think is more important than sleep. I can count the number of things I think are more important than sleep on the fingers of one finger. Okay, I love sleep. It's the best thing. Okay? One of the great blessings that God has given me is to pastor a church with an actual sleep therapist in it. It's amazing. Because when I have had problems with my sleep, I've gone to her. It's Helen, by the way. Helen, stick up your hand. If you have a problem with sleep, go and talk to Helen. She's a genius. It's amazing. I love sleep. Jesus thought that praying was more important than sleep. Strategy. King David, who was a giant-slaying, Philistine-conquering man of God. He's a quintessential James Bond of the Old Testament. Men wanted to be him, women wanted to be with him. He thought that prayer was more important than military strategy. The most successful general in Israel's history as a nation prayed instead of planning at times, right? You can read that in Psalm 63 verse 1. What does he make time to do? He prays. Actually, there's a reason for that I'm not going to go into today. But prayer is strategy. Right? You'll often find that when you're wanting to make a plan about something, the best way to make the plan is to start to pray about it. I am going to go into it, it turns out. I planned my entire undergraduate law dissertation whilst praying on the way back from a party. Right? I'm not exaggerating. I won't say that, that's rude. Terrified. Because I'd put this dissertation proposal in to the law faculty at my university, and it was all about taking on a decision of the US Supreme Court. That's the thing about undergraduate lawyers is they're quite arrogant. The thing about undergraduate lawyers at Cambridge is that they're very arrogant. And I was a good example of that. And so I put in this dissertation topic. I said the Supreme Court have got it wrong, obviously, because they're only the most experienced and well-trained lawyers in the world. They've got this decision wrong. I'm going to explain why. And I put this thing in, and unsurprisingly, it got approved, right? I mean, if you were a law faculty member, you'd want to know why the Supreme Court got it wrong. I mean, that's an interesting, probably quite an easy dissertation to mark. No. So I put this thing in, they accepted it, it got 6 months down, and I thought, I don't know. I read this, went away and reread this Supreme Court decision, and I read it, I thought, wow, it's really good. Turns out that they're quite good at their jobs. It's really good. And I'm in a lot of trouble, because there's quite a high percentage of my undergraduate degree is now riding on me explaining why this is wrong. And so I did what most undergrads would do. I went to a party and tried to forget about it. And that didn't work. And so I was on my way back from my friend's house, and I was coming back from this party, walking across Cambridge at midnight or something like that, in the dark, and I started to pray, right? And I don't want you to think this is out of holiness, it's out of panic. I started to pray, and blow me down if by the time I made it back to college, I didn't have the entire outline of my dissertation in my head. Now, that's not because I'm a brilliant lawyer. I genuinely mean that prayer is planning. Prayer is planning, right? Because God is a much better lawyer than me. Jesus is a much better lawyer than me. Much better lawyer than you. Much better lawyer than the Supreme Court in America. He's a much better architect than you, or whatever your thing is. She knows how to raise your kids better than you do. Prayer is planning. Anyway, David planned through prayer. Good administration. Acts chapter 6. We read this story. It's important for the way that we run churches. But the striking thing is they're distributing food. And Peter says, that's just not what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to be praying. I can't be in charge of distributing food. Prayer is the most important thing we do. Now, he doesn't say nobody gets any food. He finds some people to go and do it. But it's really important. Just as you can't get to know another person without learning to communicate with them, you cannot grow in a knowledge of God without learning to pray. Second reason why prayer is more important than anything else is that prayer changes things. It makes a difference to the world around you. Now, that can be difficult to accept for two groups of people. The first are Calvinists. Right? If you're a Calvinist, welcome, we love you. You're very welcome in this church. But then you probably didn't have a choice to be here anyway. Don't worry if you didn't get that. It's a theological joke. That's why I get the big bucks. There's a kind of school of thought in Christian life that's kind of fatalistic. What's going to happen is going to happen anyway, whatever happens. So there's nothing I can do about it. I'm sympathetic to that. God is sovereign and in control over everything. But actually, the Bible says prayer changes things. St. James, Jesus' brother, says, you do not have because you do not ask. Right? He could not be clearer. If you'd asked, you would have. But you don't ask, and so you don't have. Right? Prayer changes things. The second group who can struggle with this, and this is probably where intuitively most of us seem to fit, is modernists. People who believe that the universe is a closed system. If this is all going over your head, don't worry, I'm going to get into the Bible in a minute. But there's a school of thought nowadays that everything is just chemistry. Right? That it's not just that prayer doesn't change anything, there's no such thing as people. They don't change anything either. Everything is pre-planned. It's just working out like a chemical reaction from the beginning of time. And if you could look and work out all of the chemical reactions, you could determine what anybody would say. Now, that's a terrifying thing to believe. If you're somebody here who's believing that, if you really believe in materialism, that's that all there is matter, and that all there is chemical reactions. You know, Rich Dawkins is a proponent of this. It's not a new philosophy. There's no such thing as the soul. There's really no such thing as the mind. It's just an illusion. An illusion in whose mind, I don't know, but leave that for one side. And every time we make a choice, it's just a chemical reaction that's determined by all the previous chemical reactions. Then there's no point praying. Indeed, there's no point doing anything. Like, you don't exist. You have no more personhood than a rock. Because that's just a bunch of chemicals and you're just a bunch of chemicals. Now, when I describe it like that and explain the impact of it, it's not only a terrible philosophy because it leads to despair, it's also bonkers. But it's the prevailing view in the world, in the West at the moment. Right? It's the kind of casual materialism. Actually, I don't really exist, you don't really exist, so it doesn't matter what we do. The Bible and the Christian worldview doesn't have any truck with that position at all. You are not just a bundle of chemicals reacting together in a pre-planned, predetermined way that could be traced back to the beginning of time. You are a person with a mind, a soul, and dignity. And so is every other person. You have free agency. You are able to make decisions that determine what happens around you. Freely. And one of the ways that you can determine what happens around you is to pray. You might not understand why God chooses to use prayer. I don't understand why he chooses to use me at all. But he does. He chooses to use you. And part of the way he chooses to use you is in praying. Now, I don't have time to cover all the different ways you can pray in this talk. You might want to get this book. This is How to Pray by Pete Greig. If you're interested in digging into prayer, this is by far the best book on the subject. We spent most of last term looking at it, so you can, if you're somebody who doesn't like to read, you like to listen, you can, not last term, last year looking at it, you can go on our YouTube channel and listen to the talks from last year and they'll cover Pete's content. But if you want to dig in deeply, that's what I recommend. I'm going to zone in for the rest of this talk and think about two big issues that come up. First, what do I say if I want to pray? And second, how do I pray? How do I do it? What do I say? And how do I do it? I've got in mind that I want to be a man who drives out demons, provides for his family, sees miracles work, and is a consequential warrior in the kingdom of God, but I don't know how. Well, let's look at that. What do I say? There are loads of different ways to pray. And there's no magic words. The difference between prayer and magic is it's not that you find a formula and then God has to do what you say. It's not like Harry Potter. It's about a relationship. It's about coming to someone who has the power to do whatever he wants. And that means there are no magic words. You pray like you. Right? You don't need to pray in King James English. You don't need to pray in a particularly flowery way. You pray whatever you want to pray. However you pray. It's personal. But, with that said, there is a framework you can follow that you can structure your prayers around. It consists of 3 words that I've mentioned before. Thank, cast, and ask. That is easy to remember. I'm trying to make it as easy to remember as I can. Thank, cast, and ask. Thank means what it says. When you pray, give thanks for what you've received. Or for who Jesus is. Thank you. Do not be anxious for anything, St. Paul writes, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. Practicing gratitude builds faith, humility, and joy. It is a really important way of praying. Thank. It's actually psychologically very good for you as well. Right? It has measurable outcomes, as psychologists chart. Indeed, that's one of the problems with the modern world. I'm not spending a whole day railing against modernity. It's great. It gave us dentistry. I love it. But one of the big problems psychologically, and when you move into a post-Christian, post-God world, is that no one has anyone to say thank you to. And it causes enormous psychological problems because it's not the way you're designed to live. Cast. That's a funny word. What it means is share your burdens with God. This can include any of the things that weigh us down, like rocks in a backpack. It can include doubt. Pray about your doubts. The psalmists do. There's psalms all about doubt. Lord, there are times this week where I wonder whether you're even there. Or am I just speaking to the air? It's fine to pray about that. Right? God knows you feel like that anyway. Don't keep it hidden. Bring it to him. Sadness. Anxiety, so that's worry. Tiredness. Over time, these things become joy-sapping and faith-destroying if you try and carry them alone. Like running with a bag of rocks on your back, it knackers you out. Happily, you don't have to carry them alone. You can cast them onto God. You say, I wonder why it is that when I've talked like this before in different contexts, people find it slightly jarring. There's a slight about it. I think it's because we worry that if we make ourselves vulnerable about doubt or about sadness or about anxiety, to the wrong person, they can end up dismissing us or judging us. Now, those fears are real and they're rooted in real experience, right? You trust the wrong person, then you can get yourself hurt. Happily, God isn't like that. It says in Proverbs 18, verse 24, one who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin. Isn't that true? But there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. It's talking about the Lord. The other worry can be that saying something out loud makes it more real. Right? I don't want to acknowledge that I have doubts because speaking them makes them more real. Actually, the opposite is true most of the time. Talking about something helps us to see that they're just thoughts. You are not your thoughts. These are just thoughts. Saying them to somebody, often you see how silly they are. It's a way of robbing something of power, like turning the light on when there's a monster in the closet. You realise it's a shirt, and you go back to sleep. There's also a sense that the Lord supernaturally lifts stuff from us. It says, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety onto him because he cares for you. So cast, thank, cast, and ask. Finally, ask for what you need. Nothing is too small or silly. Jesus taught his followers to pray for the bread they were going to eat that day. The most basic needs and the greatest desires can be brought to God. So how? I'm going to be quick on this. How do we start to practice this discipline? Right? This is my application section. To become key to becoming a man or a woman of prayer, a warrior in the kingdom of God, is to realize this is something you grow into. Right? Now that's obvious when you think about it. You don't become the centre forward for Spurs overnight. You have to go through youth teams, you get better and better and better until eventually you can score whenever you want to. Right? The same's true about whatever else it is you're into. You'd grow in it, right? The same's true with prayer. What we realise we read that in Luke chapter 11, verse 1. It says, one day Jesus was praying in a certain place. When he'd finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples. Prayer is something we learn over time. You get better at it. So how do you get better at it? Well, Matthew 6, Jesus gives 4 principles to learning to pray that are really easy to start and very practical. I'm not going to read it because I'm running out of time. You can work your way through Matthew 6, verses 5 to 15. You'll see all of these verses, all these ideas. Here they are, though. Pick a regular time and place. If you were serious about growing as a man or a woman of prayer, pick a regular time or place to do it. Really helps. Doesn't need to be in front of icons with candles blazing all around you, although that can be helpful, and I do that. So if that's something you're very attracted to spiritually, then feel free to do that. It can be a usual chair. It can be the shower. Though try not to put your mouth under the water. It can be the kettle in the kitchen. It's a normal place that you pray. Pick a place and a time that you regularly have a few moments on your own and make that your prayer time and your prayer place. There's real power in it, it's the association it brings. Find quiet. Jesus says we should shut the door in Matthew 6. Prayer is closely linked to the discipline of silence because it's about listening as well as about talking. That doesn't just mean finding somewhere where it's not noisy, although that can be helpful. It means turning off distractions. Leave your phone in a different room. Turn off the radio. Turn off the TV. Try and be away from others so you can focus. It's only going to be for a short time. But if you don't do that, you'll find it really difficult. Start small. We miss this. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he gave them 6 lines. Start small. Quick, easy to memorize prayer. If you're new to praying, begin by repeating the Lord's Prayer, thanking God for one thing, and praying for a family or friend. No more than 2 minutes. If you're beginning to pray and you're praying for more than 2 minutes, you're praying for too long. I want you to stop. because you won't do it again, right? That you can pray for 15 minutes one day and then the next day you'll be like, oh, I'm knackered from that. I don't have the time. 2 minutes, if that. 1 minute if you can. Let it grow. Finally, be willing to change. The last thing Jesus says is that if you want your prayers to produce results, you have to be willing to change how you behave. Right? As you forgive others, so your Father in heaven will forgive you. You have to be willing to change if you want God to answer your prayers. It's as simple as that. Find a place and time, be quiet, start small, and be willing to change. If you put that into action, over time you will see amazing things happen. Prayer is how we communicate with God, thanking him for what we have, sharing our burdens, and asking for what we need.